Hey everybody! Today we are going to be doing an ongoing tutor training for the Catherine McCauley Center about the side-by-side books, some tips and tricks for how to use them. So for those of you who don't know me and haven't met me yet, my name is Katie Rosenberger, and I am the Learning and Curriculum Specialist here at the Catherine McCauley Center. So without further ado, let's get into it. I'd like you all to take a second before we do this training to answer a couple of questions. And you can comment below with your answers for these, or you can send an email to education@cmc-cr.org. So first, I would like to know, have you used the side-by-side books before? If yes, maybe which ones or with which student? What questions do you have going into today's training? Again, if you've used the books before, this is a good chance to think about any challenges that you've had with the books, any frustrations or things you're wondering about. And also kind of a pop quiz. What 4 language skills should you practice in every session with your students? So you might know the answer to that already. So take a guess, write it down. You can pause the video and take a chance to answer these. And then as we go along, kind of listen to see if your questions are answered, see if you had the right idea about those 4 language skills. So yeah, take a second, pause the video, take care of that, and we'll meet back here in just a minute. Did you pause? Did you do it? For real, go do it. Okay, here we go. If you've answered all of your questions, then we'll head along into the meat of today's training. So the side-by-side series is made up of 4 levels. So these are all 4 levels here. We've got on the left side of the screen, hopefully, unless this is a mirror image for me, we've got the blue book is level 1. And that's going to deal with very pretty beginner level English, grammar, things like, how are you today? I am fine, my name is. Present continuous tense shows up in there a lot, like today we are learning about the side-by-side books. And level 4 is going to get into much more advanced, very nuanced grammar patterns, things that aren't quite as frequent. These are things that maybe, you know, a lot of English learners will substitute another form instead of the, I guess we could say the correct or kind of proper pattern. So things like, there's a chapter about if I were you, I would, such and such. So if I were you, I would take some notes on this video to refer back to later so you can remember what we talked about, something like that. So yeah, level 1, I think pretty easy to explain. And then level 4 gets into some patterns that you might not have even ever really thought about in English before, ever noticed yourself doing. So it really spans quite a large range. So today we're going to focus on a chapter from book 2, chapter 7, and kind of see specifically what that chapter looks like, but this information will apply to any book in this side-by-side series. So here we go. The first thing to know with these books is that the navigation can be a little bit tricky when you're starting out. So there's a lot of kind of moving pieces and flipping around between books, front to back and from different book to different book. So it can be a little bit daunting at first, but if you stick with it and get the hang of it, it really does flow together quite well. And you'll get the sense of the pattern after you've taught through a few chapters of this. It will feel very intuitive, and you'll get the hang of it. So hang in there. And it will get much easier with time. So the main thing to know is that you're going to be flipping back and forth between the textbook or the student book and then the workbook. So you can see here the covers of them have slightly different kind of coloring on them. So you can identify them that way. The workbook also has a bar at the top that says activity workbook. And then we've gone the extra mile as well with our tutor books in the lobby and labeled them textbook and workbook at the bottom. So you know exactly which one is which and how, you know, and that you've got both of them with you. So whenever you come in for a lesson, make sure you grab both of those. Make sure your student has a copy of both because they do fit together to make up the lessons. So your friendly guide, I think my face might be cutting that off a little bit, but your friendly guide for how the textbook and workbook fit together is going to be the correlation key. So if you flip to the back of the workbook, the very last page of the workbook is where you can find the correlation key. There's also, it's a little bit cut off here, but there's also a tab that should mark that for you as well. So look for that tab, look for that last page of the workbook and find your correlation key. So this, I think it makes a lot more sense when you see it in action than when you're just kind of looking at it on the page. But basically, the textbook is going to make up kind of the core of the lesson, and then there will be some additional activities for you to practice in the workbook with your students. So anytime a textbook page corresponds to a workbook activity, that will be noted in the correlation key. So for example, let's say I did page 62 with my student in the textbook. Then I would know, okay, there's a workbook activity that goes along with that. So we're going to flip to page 60 in the workbook to find that activity. If you don't see a textbook page listed in that column, that just means that there's no workbook activity to go with it, so you can just move right along to the next page. So we're going to look at page 61, I think is the opening of chapter 7, and there's no workbook activity with that. You just do that page and then hop right along to page 62 and don't worry about the workbook until you get there. So again, this really does, you start to see the pattern of the types of activities that tend to have a workbook page that go with them, and you'll get the hang of it the more you work through it. So typically you're going to, not in every case, but in many cases, you're going to have a verbal activity in the textbook, and then you'll see that same kind of pattern or vocabulary then in a more written type of activity in the workbook. So that tends to be the pattern. Again, not true in every case, but oftentimes that's how it shapes up. So that is where those 4 skills, 4 language skills come in. So do you remember at the beginning of the video, I asked you to think about what 4 skills you should practice in every lesson? Now we'll see. So in every lesson, we could think of these as 4 skills or maybe 4 modalities of language, is how sometimes we talk about them in ESL teaching. So we want to listen, speak, read, and write. Those are all the ways that we use language, and we want to make sure we're giving our students practice with each of those. So typically, your student will be stronger in some of these skills than in others. So I have many students who are very good at speaking and listening. They use English a lot in their daily life. They're out in the world, they're talking to people at their job, but maybe when it comes to reading and writing, they haven't had as much practice with that, so they struggle a little bit more. Or maybe they have some underlying kind of difficulty with literacy that comes out. So then the opposite can also be true. Maybe your student attended a university in their country of origin, and they had many classes about English, and so they were using English in their classes, but not necessarily in an authentic way. Maybe they have very strong reading and writing abilities. Maybe they're really, workbook activities come really easily for them, but then when it comes to actually talking and holding up, their side of a conversation, they maybe struggle with that a lot more. So think about your student and think about where they might fit into that. It's pretty rare, I would say, for a student to be totally equal in those. So the other thing to note here is that we talk about, I think it's receptive and productive skills. So you can think of that as inputs. So listening and reading, you're taking in communication from someone else, and then outputs, when we're speaking, when we're writing, we are outputting communication to someone else. So the intaking ones, listening and reading, tend to come sooner for people than the outputting. So if your student is struggling with something, you might have them spend some time listening and reading and kind of give them a chance to absorb it before you then have them try to produce that language, because that's a little bit trickier for some people. So we're going to get into some types of activities, and I'm going to try to remember to tell you where to find them in the book. We'll see how I do with that. But we'll at least go through some examples of the different types of activities. We won't get into every single one, but just some of the common ones, and we'll also focus on some that people tend to struggle with a little bit more. So the chapter introduction page is basically your chance to preview everything that you're going to be working on in the chapter with your students. So chapter 7, we can see here, we've got our grammar patterns here in this red bar that we're going to be discussing, and the topic. So a lot of the vocabulary is going to be around this blue bar here. So I would just take this as a chance to introduce that concept to my students, see if they know much about it already, kind of activate some of their background knowledge. You could talk to them about public transportation. Many of our students use public transportation. Many of them have used it in multiple countries, so ask them about that. Ask them how they get around town. How about give me some directions? Tell me how you get from your home to the Catherine McCauley Center. Tell me how you get to work, for instance. So this is your chance to kind of do some observations about what your student already knows. And then maybe make a mental note of some things that might be a little trickier for them as you get into the chapter, and things you might want to pay a little bit more attention to. So you're also going to have the vocabulary preview. This is basically just dumping all of the words onto you all at once, which isn't the best teaching practice, but I find that students tend to know most of these words already, or at least they've encountered them before. So usually there's only a few new words, excuse me, at any point in this vocabulary preview. So you can dive into the words that are new for your student, but then just kind of gloss over the ones that they already know. So these are going to pop up throughout the chapter and be recycled constantly. So it's just a chance to, preview, like they say, and see what you're going to be getting into. So the way that the grammar in these books is presented is very intuitive and makes a lot of sense for some people and is a little bit trickier for others. So it's basically just going to plunk the pattern down for you there in these blue boxes. So here we're looking at some prepositions or kind of like phrases for how to describe directions. So prepositions like across from, next to, between. It's not going to explain at all how to actually use them or what the rule is behind it. Some students really want to have that background information, so you can provide that. I you know, over the years, I have my little bag of tricks. Now I I know a lot more about English grammar than when I started. But at the beginning, I honestly did a lot of Googling. I would just kind of look things up and try to think through, you know, what actually is happening there, so that I could explain it to someone. You can also, later we'll talk about the teacher's guide. You can also check in the teacher's guide to find some explanations of why things are the way that they are. So I would just take a second to get oriented to the picture on the page too, if necessary. This actually has a lot of information compared to some pictures in these activities. So we've got a city street here with a lot of different places on it. So you could kind of review the vocabulary that you had just looked at and see, you know, what they can identify on the street, get oriented to that, because we're going to be using that then in the dialogue below. So these are going to be an exchange. So I would have the student pick, do you want to be A or B? And then say, okay, you want to be B, so I will be A. I will read A, then you read B. We'll see how it goes, and then we'll practice our own conversation. So I would say, hey, excuse me, could you please tell me how to get to the hospital from here? And then you or the student could read part B. Then I would say, thanks. So you're gonna have that same pattern, then you're going to practice it with some different scenarios. So in this case, you know, we're starting from the zoo at number 1, and we're going to the museum. So then I would substitute that in and say, excuse me, could you please tell me how to get to the museum from here? And the student would look at the picture above and give me directions from the zoo to the museum. So the thing to know here is that, well, 2 things really. Number 1, make sure you switch places with your student. So I would either go through the whole thing as A and then go back, and I now am B and you are A, and have them practice asking me the question. That is really important, so they get a chance to practice the question form, because that is quite different in English than in some other languages. And it takes practice. So make sure they get practice with both roles. The other point I was going to make now has escaped me. So we'll see if it comes back to me. Yeah, I guess that was the main important thing. If it comes back to me, I'll tell you. But okay, so this, if you look at the bottom here, this was page 63 from the textbook. So if you remember our correlation key, whoops, page 63 in the textbook corresponds to page 61 in the workbook. Look at that. So if you look here, this we're doing verbally. We're giving directions verbally. Now we're going to flip into the workbook and we're going to give directions, pretty much the same exact activity, except now we're doing it in writing. So we're reading and writing here. So this is where the correlation key, you know, if you can follow it, please do, because it really, then you don't even have to think about, are we listening and speaking and reading and writing? It's just all done for you. Look at that, it's easy. Some tutors like to assign the workbook pages as homework. If your student is one who has the time and energy and wants to do homework at home, I think that's a great idea. You can do kind of introduce the concepts in the textbook and then have them take the workbook home and do it on their own. In that case, I would say definitely have them bring it back and actually go over it with them to make sure that it went okay. But it's also fine to just do it together in your lesson. That's, I think most of the time with students, we'll just either they'll work on it quietly and then we'll go over it together, or you can actually talk through with them and do kind of each one together. So after doing the workbook activity, you would just kind of go back and pick up where you left off in the textbook. So from page 61 in the workbook, we would just jump right back into the textbook and start up with page 64. Easy as pie, right? So another kind of activity that you might run into are our listening activities. So as we know, listening is an important skill for speaking English. And these are going to have some answers basically that your student will select from. And then you have a listening script. Whoops, I gave it away already. You have a listening script. So you'll flip into the back of the book, get your listening script, read from that, and then your student will select the correct answer. So for example, what's the word? Number 1, the clinic is on the right next to the post office. So your student would have to decide is the answer A, right, or B, left. And they can make their selection. So these have a tab. So if you just look for the tab, you'll find the listening script. These show up in both the textbook and the workbook. So for these, you do not need to go into a whole different book. So that means if you're in the textbook, your listening scripts tab will be right there in your textbook. And likewise, if you're in the workbook and you come across the listening activity, the tab will be at the back of your workbook. So just stay in the same book and look for the tab, and that should not lead you astray. Let's hope. So reading is another thing that pops up. There's at least one reading passage in every chapter. So there's kind of a different, everyone has their own kind of style when working through these together, but I like to mine these for as much learning as possible. So don't just read through it and then move on. I think that there's so much more that you can really pull out of this, to be honest, and really make the most of it. So I would, before even reading, I like to kind of set up what we're going to be doing. So we would look at the picture. I would ask them some questions about the picture, maybe have them make some inferences about the story, like, you know, who is this guy? And maybe they would notice the name Harold in the title. So maybe they would say, oh, hey, maybe that's Harold. And then I would say, what is he doing? What do you think he's up to? And just kind of get their brains flowing about it a little bit. You might pull out some vocabulary from the reading that you suspect could be tricky for your student and kind of set them up for success in reading by reviewing the vocabulary first. Then you want to take turns reading. I really like reading out loud, but I find that when students are reading out loud, they tend to just kind of focus in on their pronunciation and not be comprehending what they're reading. I do this too. Sometimes I speak a bit of French, so sometimes when I'm like practicing and trying to read something out loud to myself, I will get super zoned in on my pronunciation, but then not think at all about what I'm actually reading. So you read, and then they can kind of listen and follow along and try to understand, and then give them the chance to read so that they can, you know, they can get some speaking in, they can read out loud, but they're hopefully at this point already building their understanding of the passage that they're reading. So you also want to think about both big picture and little picture. Some of you may have also attended trainings where we talked about top down versus bottom up here. So big picture would be like, what is this story about? What's going on in the story? What are, what's the logistics here? Little picture would be more detailed things like the grammar. You might pull out some of the grammar patterns that you've been studying in the chapter and just kind of analyze them in the story. So I might have them look for some of those prepositions that we practiced before, see if they can identify them in the story. Then with pretty much everything we do here, our students are adults. They have real world kind of urgent needs for English. So I like to put everything into those terms as explicitly as I can. So what are some practical takeaways from this? How can we apply it? So maybe we read this story and then we apply this to the student's life. And I've had students who have smartphones. I've had them take out their smartphone and will actually pull up their navigator on their phone and practice reading directions to an actual place that they go, and reading the directions on their navigator app. You can also practice verbally giving each other directions. There's a lot of different ways you could go with that. So make it real, make it practical, and give them something they can actually put into use right away. So there is a reading checkup that goes with each of these, a kind of a comprehension activity. But like I said, I think there's so much more learning that can come from this than just the reading checkup. So really, yeah, take advantage of these passages. They can be quite helpful in a lot of cases. So now, oh, I should say the reading shows up primarily, I think exclusively actually, in the textbook. Now, grammar wraps. You love them or you hate them. These are going to be in the workbook. And yeah, everyone's favorite feature, wink, wink. Some people get super into these. I've walked by study partners working together, like working them out, getting all the claps in, and like almost, like rehearsing it together. And then I've also heard tutors say, oh, we don't like those grammar wraps, and then just skip right over it. So wherever you fall on that spectrum, I would like to bring you today more towards appreciating them, if not enjoying them, at least appreciating them for the learning that they can offer to your students. So these, although they say grammar, these are actually pronunciation activities. Let that sink in for a second. So some of you, if you have attended the pronunciation training, will have heard already about the idea of stress timing versus syllable timing. So this has to do with the rhythm of a language. So many languages, Spanish, for instance, are what we would call syllable timed. So that basically means that every syllable will have the same, will take the same amount of time to say. So some of them may be stronger than others, but overall they will take the same amount of time to speak. So if you turn on like Telemundo or Univision or something, and listen to some Spanish, you might hear that kind of da 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 da. Every syllable is very kind of pronounced. In English, on the other hand, we have stress timing. So basically, the amount of time in between stressed syllables will be the same, but the amount of syllables in between those points can vary pretty significantly. So an example I like to use is if I say dogs chase cats. That takes the same amount of time as if I say the dogs chase the cats, or the dogs will be chasing the cats. You can hear that stress point is the thing that determines the rhythm. So if I'm adding more syllables, I'm not increasing the amount of time it takes me to say that. I'm actually just kind of squishing them in and making them smaller so that they can fit. So quick and dirty version of English timing. So this is basically what you're practicing here, is the syllable timing of English. So you're going to see for each of these dots, that's a stressed syllable. You want to clap or tap on the table and try to just keep a regular rhythm as you're saying those. So I'm going to be really dorky for a second and kind of show you what this means. So I would kind of do this, demonstrate, and then maybe have my student do it along with me, and then have them do it on their own, kind of an I do, we do, you do here. And it might sound something like this. So I have a terrible sense of direction. I never know which way to go. This way or that way, this way or that way. I never know which way to go. So you can see kind of getting that rhythm down. And it is very, I'm sorry, it's very cringy as raps and rhymes go. It's just, it's not the best, best quality, but as far as actually practicing with your students, it's really, really helpful for them. So that's basically the idea with grammar raps. I hope that after today you'll, again, if not enjoy them, at least appreciate them a little bit more. So I should also say these show up in the workbook primarily. You'll have at least one for every chapter, and sometimes if it's a trickier, if you're studying a grammar pattern that's a little bit trickier as far as pronunciation, then you might have more of them. This is also really honestly the #1 thing you can do to improve your students' pronunciation, is to improve their understanding of the rhythm of English. A lot of people get fixated on individual sounds, and to be honest, that in some cases it can be helpful, but it doesn't get in the way of understanding quite as much as the rhythm. So you put the emphasis on the wrong syllable and it's going to be really difficult to understand what you're trying to communicate. So moving on, there are quite a few tests, and I'm really sorry for the noise outside. There's a street cleaner that's going by my window, so that might be the noises that you, beeping and noises that you hear. So anyway, tests. We have for each chapter a test. There is also a mid-book test that comes as it sounds in the middle of the book, and an end of book test that shows up at the very end. So these are designed to track your students' progress, to make sure that they understand what you've been working on together, and every chapter is going to build on the one before. So this is basically your chance to see how your student's doing and determine whether you need to stay back and do a little bit of review, or if they're ready to move on and take in some kind of new information from the next chapter. So for all of our tests, we're looking for about an 80% score. They look like this. It's just a same old test that everyone's kind of used to. But we do want to see 80% on these before you go on to the next chapter. So if your student gets a lower score than that, bring it into the office. We'll look it over. We'll help you figure out what to do from there. If they pass, they get 80% or above, then you can just, well, in either case, you will want to record their score in the chapter test scores section in your tutor log. But again, if they get a lower score, come on into the office and we'll help you figure out what to do from there. If they get 80% or above, then that means you're fine to go on. You can just start, in this case, you would just go right on to chapter 8 and keep rolling. So these are in the filing cabinet in the education office, and they're color coded. The files are color coded. So book 2 is the red book, so we would just look in these red section of the folders there and find what we need. I should say too, there's an answer key for all of the tests as well. So yeah, just ask education staff if you need any help finding that. So the teacher's guide and supplements are going to be another element that can support you in this series. We've really been through the core parts of all of it, but now we're getting into some additional resources that you can use. So the teacher's guide is a great tool. It's by no means required, but a lot of people really do find it super helpful. So these are the spiral bound volumes. They'll be the same color as a student book that you're looking at, but they're organized by page number of the textbook. So you'll see here, if you're studying in the textbook page 62, then you could find that, just flip through and see kind of at the top of the pages, you know, where to find the information for that page and the teacher's guide. So this is where you can find the explanations that I mentioned before, that you can find explanations or the kind of rules of grammar spelled out for you. So that, again, book 1, book 2, usually not as big of a deal, but in book 4, I tend to try to have the teacher's guide right next to me because it gets into some kind of gnarly grammar that's pretty difficult to explain sometimes. So it'll also explain kind of like what we've been talking through today. It'll tell you actually how to do each activity. So this is great for study too. We've had tutors take them home and just kind of read through them and study them a little bit to get the hang of the books. That's what I did when I was first learning. I just kind of would read through the lessons in the teacher's guide before I taught them and see what I was supposed to do. So there's also expansion activities and kind of end of chapter additional activities that you can do. These are designed for a class, so you might have to adapt them a little bit for a one-on-one setting, but they, yeah, there's some good ideas in there. You can also find the answer key for the workbook in the teacher's guide. So again, book 1, not as much of a concern, but once you get to book 4, even book 3, sometimes there's some things that can be a little trickier. So if you're unsure of the answer for something, you can always, you can always pull out the teacher's guide and kind of see what they were getting at with that activity. So the listening scripts are in the teacher's guide as well. So if you're a person who wants to have, if you don't like the flipping back and forth between things, you can actually just pull out the teacher's guide and have that next to you, and then have the textbook or workbook as well. So however your brain works, that might be helpful to you. Now with supplements, the first thing to know is that your environment is a great teaching tool. So I myself am a pretty tactile, like kinesthetic type of learner, and I like to do things and see like more concrete stuff around me, especially when it comes to language learning. That can be super helpful. So like we've been talking about giving directions, if it's a nice day outside, you might actually walk outside. Crazy idea, right? Go look, there are street signs all around. So go out to the street, look at the signs out there, practice kind of waving your arms and giving directions from the street as you would if you were actually trying to tell someone how to get somewhere. We saw kind of at the beginning of this section, Maisha here was learning about talking about time in English. So her tutor pulled the clock off the wall, and they actually just used the clock to practice that, which I think is a great idea. Why not? Just put it back to the actual time before you put it on the wall, or we might have some people a little confused. So yeah, look around. We've got the food pantry shelf is super helpful for if you're talking about food, or like there's in book 2 specifically, there's a section about like measurements, like pounds and ounces, and how we talk about food using those measurements. So yeah, go grab a can off the shelf and see how they note how much is in that can. Why not? There are also, I mentioned too before, if your student does not pass a chapter test, oftentimes what we'll do is give you a review packet. We have some that are made up, excuse me, for every chapter of every book. You can also just pull these out if you want some extra practice, even if your student, you know, if you think they're doing fine, but you think, well, maybe a little extra practice wouldn't hurt with that. You can go grab a packet. These will have grammar, vocabulary, we've tried to include some more practical things in here too, like this one is about reading a train schedule. We don't have trains here, but we do have buses, so yeah, that might be helpful. Come on into the office and get those from us. We also have a lot of other materials around the center. We've got picture dictionaries. You can see those here in the back. A lot of different picture dictionaries you can pull out, as well as a subscription to the News for You student newspaper. So this is specifically for English learners, and it'll deal with the events of the day, current events. So you can see it's 2020. We're talking about the census right now. So the News for You is really great for students in like side-by-side 3 and 4 for sure. And then maybe if you've got a student in side-by-side 2 who's pretty strong on reading, it could be good for them too. Side-by-side 1, students might find that a little bit trickier. So I might just use different materials if I was working from side-by-side 1. There's also a lot of web-based materials out there that you can use. So News ELA is another popular news site for English learners. News for You also has a website, a web version that you can go, and you can actually log on and see pretty much the same articles. There might be a few extra ones in the online version, but you can actually listen to them as well, which is super awesome. You can kind of read along and hear the audio version of them. And there are some interactive activities that go along with them. You can have your student write a comment to add to the article. Sometimes people, have little discussions in the comment section. So yeah, another great resource. We have an account, CMC, so you can just ask us for the password so that your student can come ask us for the password so you can get on and access that. There is also, for this series, side by side, an e-text. So that is pretty much the textbook on the computer, except there are going to be some interactive elements thrown in. So every page will have some things you can click on within the page, and then at the end of the chapter there will be, it's called the fun zone, that has just some extra kind of interactive. There's like flashcards for the grammar or for the vocabulary, some like basically kind of stuff that you might see in the workbook. It's more interactive, so they can actually practice, maybe do some word puzzles, things like that. So that's a great resource. We have those. We have an account at the center that you can just ask us for, or you can flip to the inside cover of your student's textbook, and there are instructions right here on the inside and a code that they can use to get that set up. So you can also send them to the language lab. I always encourage tutors to make a plug for the language lab. So we've got the hours posted in the education office, so you can find out when our language lab facilitator will be around to help people access all the resources that are available to them on the computers in the language lab. So we're getting down to the end. I just want to leave you with a quick note on kind of shaping your hour. This is a great tie-in to our larger training, which is called Shape Your Hour or Shape the Hour, that is about actually how to structure a lesson, but just kind of a quick little note for you. This is how a typical lesson kind of is proportioned with my students. So we'll spend a few minutes chatting. I like to say, I got this from Stephen, chat with a purpose. So I'm going to chat with them. I'm going to build I'm going to build my relationship with them and my rapport, and ask them about what they're doing. But I'm going to just sprinkle some learning into that as well. So this is almost like my stealth time where I will try to get my student to use the grammar that we've been practicing. So really easy example might be like, let's say we were studying the past tense, and we started up with my student and I said, hey, how are you doing today? What did you do last weekend? Tell me about what you did. And that gives me a chance to kind of, I'm not going to necessarily be correcting them at this point, because this is really mostly about me just getting to know them a little bit, but I'm going to be just making a mental note of like, they're getting those ed past tenses in there, but there's a few irregular, maybe they said I buy groceries instead of I bought groceries, and just be kind of observing how they're using language when they're not actually concentrating on it. What are they genuinely adopting into their kind of, I guess, bank of English? So, especially if your student is only coming once a week, you're going to want to spend a fair amount of time on review. So, if it's been a week since they came and they've had a lot to deal with in the meantime, maybe they haven't had a lot of chance to practice or to think about this, give them a chance to get back into it. It never hurts to go back over what you did last time. Sometimes I'll even just kind of breeze over everything that we did in the past lesson. Just ask them if they have any questions they've thought of in the meantime. You can ask them if they've actually used any of this in their real life, if they've, noticed themselves maybe with chapter 7, maybe they actually gave directions to their coworker at work, and they can tell you about how that went for them. Once you've done that review, then you can get into the new material. So I think I tend to start more with the textbook. I wouldn't necessarily jump right into the workbook. So like if we were going to pick up with a textbook page, I would actually incorporate now I'm getting all backwards. If we were going to pick up with a workbook page, I would actually go back to the textbook page that introduced that grammar and use that as part of our review before I then went into the workbook, if that was going to be our new material for the day. So then you want to take a few minutes at the end, think about what's your send-off. You don't want to just kind of end, but think about like, what is your student taking away from this lesson? You can talk to them about that. See if there's something that they are doing this week where they could incorporate this into their language. So again, if you were like looking at that chapter about the different like measurements of items, maybe you could encourage them to actually go to the deli counter at the grocery store and order a pound of whatever, a pound of cheese, and give them, if not a homework assignment, give them something they can actually do once they leave the class. That's a great, kind of a great strategy to keep them thinking about it, even if they don't have time to work on their own. So this is also a chance for you to fill out the tutor log and think about what are we going to do next time, maybe preview the next pages that you're going to look at. So I hope this has been helpful for you guys. I am going to send you off with some homework. So in addition to the questions that you hopefully answered at the beginning of this training, I'd also like you to add what's one tip from today's training that you're going to put into practice with your student, and how are you going to do that? So bonus points if you actually do it and then tell us how it worked out for you. That would be like the best. But yeah, what are you planning to put into practice from today? And then if there are any questions that you still have, maybe you got some of your questions answered, and then that brought up some new questions, please do share those with us. We want to make sure that you have all the resources that you need to work with these books successfully. So again, you can comment on the video below, or you can send us an email at education@cmc-cr.org. Thanks so much for your attention today, and we'll see you at the center when you come in for tutoring. Bye.